So, for everything that John Cage embodies, he nearly single-handedly paved a new direction in art, not just music, but all art. Throughout his lifetime and afterwards, scholars, critics, and audiences have grappled with the complexities of his imagination, philosophy, and aesthetic approach to the making, performing, and reception of art. Though primarily recognized as an American musical iconoclast, Cage's creative efforts found outlet in many art forms: poetry, opera, theater, performance art, film, and in the last 20 years of his life, visual art. Method, structure, discipline, notation, indeterminacy, interpenetration, imitation, devotion, circumstances. These are the 10 words that Cage used to structure his mesostic essay, Composition in Retrospect, and together they form the guideposts to his aesthetic. Cage never repeated his efforts, and nor did he look for formulaic success. Instead, he sought only to move forward in his creative output. To detach himself from his likes and dislikes, Cage turned to chance operations, principally through the use of the I Ching, a Chinese book of oracles that was given to him as a gift by Christian Wolff, a high school student who had come into Cage's inner circle. By the 1950s, Cage had codified his use of chance operations and the I Ching. I use it, Cage says, as a discipline in order to free my work from my memory and from my likes and dislikes. At first, he uses chance operations to create musical works. However, Cage eventually discovers that the possibilities of chance operations can apply to all art forms. From the late 1920s until the early 1930s, Cage divided his time equally between painting and composing music. Despite graduating valedictorian from his high school class, Cage dropped out of Pomona College and convinced his parents that he should study in Paris. While in Paris, Cage worked with the modern architect Erno Goldfinger, and he spent much of his time studying Gothic architecture. In a lecture he wrote called Lecture on Commitment, he said, looking around, it was Gothic architecture that impressed me the most. And of that architecture, I preferred the flamboyant style of the 15th century. After a month of working with Goldfinger, measuring the dimensions of a room he was about to modernize, answering the telephone, and drawing Greek columns, I overheard Goldfinger saying, "To be an architect, one must devote one's life solely to architecture." I then left him, for, as I explained, there were other things that interested me, music and painting, for instance. 5 years later, when Schoenberg asked me whether I would devote my life to music, I said, of course. Returning to California in the early 1930s, Cage found various ways to make a sustainable income and connected himself with a wealthy circle of art collectors. He gave lectures on modern music and art and was able to borrow paintings by Klee and Kandinsky from his friend Gelka Scheer, who had arrived in the Hollywood Hills from the Bauhaus in Vienna. In 1937, Cage worked as a film assistant for the abstract animator Oscar Feiniger, who was experimenting with ways to manipulate the optical portions of film in order to synthesize sound. When Cage moved to New York in 1942, he lived with Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim. Shortly after, he became the art director for the Jack Leonard Larson Textile Company, where he developed an interest in typography. Cage's work in graphic design strongly impacted the look of his music. On every page of his innovative Concert for Piano and Orchestra, or the aria for solo voice, Cage's skill in creating a beautiful graphic representation of his aural world is evident. Following his studies with Arnold Schoenberg, Cage devised a method of composing that involved rhythmic structures to replace harmonic structures. For Cage, musical structure is its divisibility into successive parts, from phrases to sections. Form is content, the continuity. Method is the means of controlling continuity from note to note. The material of music is sound and silence. Integrating these is composing. He wrote that in the 1949 essay, Forerunners of Modern Music. Dividing units of time into proportional segments was to be an integral part of his working method for works outside of music. His landmark lecture on Nothing and lecture on Something both follow precise rhythmic structures, using text in place of sound to fill the containers. This is a composed talk, for I am making it just as I make a piece of music. It is like a glass of milk. We need the glass, and we need the milk. Or again, it is like an empty glass into which at any moment anything may be poured. For Cage, form was based on content, the content of which would be determined by chance operations. Everything was subjected to this method: texts, images, colors, where to make a cut, or what tool was to be used. Cage's faithful reliance on the answers given to him by the I Ching was rarely altered. Instead, Cage would alter the questions he would ask. Cage first met Marcel Duchamp when he was living with Ernst in Guggenheim, but it would take nearly 20 years before Cage gathered the courage to begin a friendship with him. Duchamp had operated on the aesthetics of indifference, and that anything could be art, provided we gave it attention. This idea was deeply resonant to Cage. Had Marcel Duchamp not lived, it would have been necessary for someone exactly like him to live, to bring about, that is, the world as we begin to know and experience it. Having this view, I felt obliged to keep a worshipful distance, though I had met him in the early 50s, and in the late 40s had written music for his sequence in Hans Richter's film, Dreams That Money Can Buy. Fortunately, during the winter holidays of 65 and 66, the Duchamps and I were often invited to the same parties. At one of these, I marched up to Tini Duchamp and asked her whether she thought Marcel would teach me chess. She said she thought he would. Circumstances permitting, we have been together once or twice a week ever since, except for the 2 weeks in Kadak when we were with each other every day. By the way, Kadak is the place where Salvador Dali lived. Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali were very, very close friends. Duchamp's death in 1969 gave Cage a reason to create his first visual work, not wanting to say anything about Marcel. It's a series of 8 plexograms made in collaboration with Calvin J. Sumison. The work is a set of lithographs printed on plexiglass. Cage called them plexograms. Each of the plexograms consists of 8 panels. 2 are bronzed and 6 are clear, for a total of 64 panels, the same number of hexagrams in the I Ching. The plexograms are mounted on a polished wooden base and are to be arranged in random order. These images were collected from the Random House dictionary and then silk-screened onto the plexiglass. The graphic work was composed, as Cage describes, by using a series of I Ching numbers to answer questions of yes or no, this or that, or how many. Determining I Ching hexagrams is an arduous and time-consuming process. Cage is painstakingly careful and labors intensively with patience and discipline. His precise execution and observation do not make the work random, but rather a fully thought out and constructed work. Even if chance operation dictates that an image or a sound appears outside the frame, its absence is as specific as its presence. As Cage told Robin White at the Crown Point Press, most people don't realize I use chance as a discipline. They think I use it, I don't know, as a way of making choices. But my choices consist in choosing which questions to ask. It is the answers to those questions that enable Cage to proceed in making his work. After gathering his answers, he sent them to Calvin Sumison, who then executed the work at the graphic studios of the Hollander Workshop in New York. As Cage writes, "I composed the graphic work and he executed it, just as I would write a piece of music and a pianist would play it." In other words, from moving from music to graphic work, I took with me the social habits of musicians, the division of labor, so to speak, composer to performer. In 1974, Cage composed a large ensemble work with electronic media called Score with 23 parts, drawings by Thoreau. In this work, he superimposes the various drawings of Thoreau on 12 lines in 5 + 7 + 5 segments, mirroring a haiku. This time, the 64-year-old Cage was to make his first etching. For this visual work, Cage replaced the traditionally notated music with Thoreau's small drawings of the natural world. These images were selected at random and with the assistance of the I Ching. Notice there are 12 what looks like measures, and each of these measures is divided into 5 + 7 + 5 segments. In 1977, Cage received a call from Cathan Brown inviting him to work at the Crown Point Press in Oakland, California. Cage accepted and began a working relationship that remained in place until his death nearly 15 years later. For his first day at the Crown Point Press, Cage arrived with Score with 23 parts tucked under his arms. He was not a trained or skilled artist. However, Cage worked diligently to acquire the necessary skill set to begin working fruitfully at Crown Point Press. He would eventually make hundreds of works during the week-long visits he made every year. In making the Score without parts, Cage said, "I had the sense that I was not an artist, that I couldn't draw really anything, but that I had done this, and it would make an etching, and did. Now, I would not say it's a very interesting one, nevertheless, it is something. And then I made a rather interesting thing there, which was called the 7-Day Diary, not knowing. Since I couldn't draw, I decided to close my eyes and draw, so that I wouldn't be embarrassed, I suppose." So human. Brown had invited Cage knowing that he had used the same general approach both in music and in art. In making the complex scores, he would start by asking as many questions as he could think of about the circumstances of the work. Then he would do a number of tests to see what the answers would look like, and if appropriate, would change his skill level. After finding out what tools would be available, for example, he would use the tools to make test lines, and then he would practice with each tool until he could use it fluidly.
Now, we did this. Now we do 8 marks with tool number 1, and one of them is short, and one of them is long, and all the rest are medium. And there are 8 altogether. I'm very happy with it. Isn't that nice? Thank you.
Cage's first large series of works at the Crown Point Press coincided with the composition of his Freeman Etudes for solo violin. The Freeman Etudes were a formidable technical challenge, like this clicker. They were said to be unplayable. In writing the work, Cage traced star charts to determine pitch and rhythm, and then consulted the I Ching for all the other parameters, using chance operations to build the full set of 32 etudes. Cage's goal was to make the etudes as difficult as possible so that it aligned with his conceptual motivation to face the practicality of the impossible. The complexity of the Freeman etudes is echoed in the complexity of the piece called Changes and Disappearances he made at Crown Point Press between 1979 and 1982. Later, Cage would comment that this set of prints is as complicated as things could be, as complicated as, say, the Freeman etudes. I like them very much. They're probably the most musical, the most detailed work with very subtle changes in colors and shapes. Just as music is made with lots of little notes, so this is made with those little pieces of color. This is the score. These are the directions that Cage had for the artwork. This is one of the pieces. Cage began every work with questions. With Changes and Disappearances, Cathan Brown noted down some of the questions that Cage specifically asked. How many colors are available? How many mixtures is it practical to make? How many different tools are there? How many types of lines, straight, curved, etc.? And are there ways to make lines besides drawing them? In the case of the last question, Cage's answer was to cut the plates so that their edges made lines, and he dropped string on the plates and traced over it for a different kind of line character. He also added thick black copied lines photographically from drawings done by Henry David Thoreau. In 1983, Cage was invited to work in watercolor by Ray Cass at the Mountain Lake Workshop in Southwest Virginia. This invitation came as a result of Cage leading a workshop in mushroom foraging in the forest of the Appalachian Mountains. Cage loved the area, and in addition to collecting mushrooms, he spent some time collecting rocks for his ever-growing collection. At the end of the mushroom foraging workshop, Ray Cass surprised Cage by bringing him to his studio and allowed Cage to play with watercolor techniques. Obviously delighted with the results, Cage accepted Cass's invitation, finishing nearly 100 watercolors, all devoted to the subject of stones. The work at Mountain Lake is quite different from that at Crown Point Press. First, the process for making watercolors is much simpler, and Cage did not want to repeat the work that he had been making at Crown Point Press. Additionally, Cage did not want to make work with traditional brushes, and instead again turned to the natural world.
All of these things that I'm doing, like my music and my writing even, are done with chance operations. Instead of making choices, I ask a question, and then I use the I Ching, which I now have in the computer. I use that to answer the questions. The implication, if you use chance operations, the implication is that every answer is good.
No, I'll take the trick. Great.
I divided the rocks into 3 groups, the big ones, the medium-sized ones, and the little ones. I did that very roughly. And then I counted the number of rocks in each group. Then I could use the I Ching. If I wanted 15 stones, first I could ask on the number 3, I could ask which ones are small, which ones are medium-sized, and which ones are large. And then when I knew that I needed 5 small ones and I knew that there was, say, 46 small ones, then I could say which ones of the 46 do I actually use, and so on with the medium and the large. Then when I have my sheet of paper, which sometimes, mostly it came from the nature of the paper. We divided all the paper into 14 differences. The first 3 days, we used first 15 stones because of Ryoanji, and then on the second day, we reduced the number of stones to a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 5. And then on the third day, we went to 1. Now we're back with 15 and multiples of 15. I make a grid either on the whole paper or on part of the paper that is 64 by 64. And that enables me, with the use of the I Ching, to find out where the upper left-hand corner of a rock goes.
Oh, looks pretty good.
It's nice, isn't it? The first 3 days' work were, all the brushes that we used were feathers. And they started because I was given this brush, which comes from a bird's wing, by Tom Marioni, an artist in San Francisco. And I liked the feathers because of well, it gave me a kind of confidence, because a feather isn't a normal brush. I'm not going to try it. Isn't that beautiful? That has more feeling of the rock than I've been able to get it. Well, we have 26 colors, and we have 7 washes. So we use the tables for 7 or 26. And if we want mixed colors, we can mix them either with themselves, or we can mix them, as we did in some of the paintings, or we can mix them with the wash colors. And we can tell the percentage. If I go to the chart of 9, then I can tell whether it's 90% and 10% of 2 colors, or whether it's 50-50, etc. I can tell which brush to use. In fact, I can tell everything that I ask by means of the chance operations. The only thing I can't ask is the actual movement of the brush. I have to accept what I do.
By 1986, Cage had gained considerable skill working with etching and printmaking. He also worked directly with the paper by crumpling it, staining it with tea and coffee, or even running a car over it. But like many artists, he also ran into blocks and insecurity, falling into a long depression and claiming his life's work was a failure. He finally decided to set the paper he was working on fire. How long the paper would burn, however, would be determined by chance operations. So began a series of works entitled Inenka, which, in addition to the fire-burned paper, used a branding iron to create an enso, a Buddhist symbol said to represent freedom, concentration, and attention to the present moment. The title Inenka is a compound word made from 3 Japanese words meaning circle, stamp, and fire. This circle, the branding iron, this is the Japanese Buddhist enso.
That's smoking. It's getting hot.
Get ready, get set, go. That's interesting. Okay.
The limit. It's completely gone.
No, there's
You
some.
found some?
So, John, is that an acceptable one, or do you want to do
No,
it
that
over?
would be acceptable. You could try to figure out how to do it.
It constitutes the square.
Right.
There's one corner and there's one corner.
Yes. Okay.
Once, when talking about his use of the I Ching to make decisions for his work, Cage said, "The implication is that if you use chance operations, every answer is good. We can infer this that the resulting work is also good, or perhaps it's better to think that there is no such thing as good or bad, just rather one result out of many possible results." It was something Cage was fond of saying throughout his life. Nichi nichi koriko nichi. Every day is a good day, provided you haven't got the motion of pleasing or displeasing in you. Like his music, Cage's visual art is about how individual things coexist into space. The relationship of these points is not to each other, but rather their relationship to the entire space. This was also a nod to his anarchist political leanings. This was in play as early as his imaginary landscape pieces of the late 1940s, and for his landmark recording of Indeterminacy in 1959 for Folkways Records. My intention in putting these stories together in an unplanned way was to suggest that all things, stories, incidental sounds from the environment, and by extension, beings, are related, and that the complexity is more evident when not oversimplified by the idea of one relationship in a person's mind. Cage was certain that we could each find for ourselves the complex relationships without relying on his interference.
The first question I ask myself when something doesn't seem to be beautiful, the first question I ask is, why do I think it's not beautiful? And very shortly you discover that there's no reason. If we can conquer that dislike, or begin to like what we did dislike, then the world is more open. That path of increasing one's enjoyment of life is the path I think we all best take. To use art not as self-expression, but as self-alteration, to become more open.
Critical remarks on Cage's use of chance operations seem to miss an important point. It was essential to him to discover a way of making art that would free him from his likes and dislikes. And it would free him from relationships found in most art-making and aesthetic paradigms. Cage wanted art to imitate nature in her manner of operation, and to do this had to set himself free from his memory, likes, and dislikes. Every sound must be considered as essentially different and independent of every other sound, Cage wrote in an essay for Modern Music. And for Cage, it would apply to all art. Each and everything, both in time and space, is related to each and every other thing in that same time and space. Relying on the I Ching and chance operations as a discipline act enabled Cage to move forward in his creative work.
What has interested me very much, both in sound and sight, graphic arts and music and so forth, is to experience each sound or each thing we see as itself, rather than as representative of something else. So that when we look, even as we do at two things that we think are identical, if we actually look at them, we see that they're not. The reason they're not is that each thing is itself at its own center, and that center is a center with respect to everything else. So that light, for instance, falls on each Coca-Cola bottle differently. So that if you look at each Coca-Cola bottle with light in mind, you'll see that they're entirely different.
Cage's creative process assists in making work where boundaries are blurred, non-hierarchical, and non-linear. The outcome of his creative work is but one possible outcome of many. Each sound, each word, and each line becomes discovered as it is in nature, acting on its own accord in relation only to the space it occupies. It is a remarkable achievement that Cage discovered a system that enabled him to allow sounds to be sounds themselves. Morton Feldman said, "John Cage was the first composer in the history of music who raised the question by implication that music could be an art form rather than a music form." Cage opened the door, allowing us to discover worlds in, through, and with his work. We continue to experience the thingness of the thing and the myriad of possibilities discovered through chance operations. And yes, there are still so many questions that are searching for answers. Thank you.
Aitäh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So maybe somebody has any comments, questions to Paul?
Paul, have you seen the visual works of Cage in
Yes.
original? And you as an artist, what do you think?
I think one of the most important things to understand about Cage is he is asking us to shift our paradigm of how we experience and perceive art. It is not good nor bad. It's just what it is. While in Boston, he made a series of what he called edible papers. These were different kinds of organic materials that were combined by chance operations because he felt that after we were done with paper, we should be able to eat it, which is really kind of funny. And what was interesting was that many of these papers were complete failures. By the time they were done, they had disintegrated and crumpled and basically not usable as paper. most people, many people, myself included, when we begin to look at Cage's work, begin to look at it with traditional concepts of looking at modern art, balance, form, color harmony. And in order to kind of really get Cage's point, you have to give up that paradigm. And this is really what 433 is about. It's about giving up the paradigm of the concert hall. And most people think that 433 is a joke, but what it is a radical shift in the way we understand what sound is. 433 was inspired by Rauschenberg's white paintings, which are basically white canvases. And what Cage really appreciated was the way the canvases changed as the light hit it. And so this empty frame in art became an empty frame for sound. Hence, any sound that came into this frame was the composition. And this is a radically different way of conceptualizing what sound is, especially in a concert hall that was attended by members of the Society of the New York Philharmonic. The Society. My God.
May I ask a stupid question?
Yeah.
In these interviews, fascinating interviews, what you showed, and also when you spoke about Cage, it was mentioned several times that there is no good nor bad and no judgment we should apply to these works or somehow put it onto that scale. But then I can't avoid thinking about this controversy of us having Cage and him being the one out there and making these works at this Crown Press and people working for him and et cetera, putting him into this very special position, you know, of in a good position, let's say, and outstanding position. Why would we need him? I mean, okay, he showed us a certain way or pointed it in music, but why? You know, he actually kept doing it. I mean, he kept doing it as an outstanding artist recognized by the big Philharmonic. You see where I'm headed, you know. I know this has been discussed, but what do you think about it? Because, you know, yes, he does say that we shouldn't look at these works, and you say it as while judging it also, but nevertheless he articulates himself in the context where what is based on that, and then he continues to do so. So he actually seems to be using the context, you know, and in a way he does the opposite of what he says. He actually does produce works himself and puts himself into this special position, whereas he says everything is equal. Do you see a controversy in that, or it's not really a problem? And you know, and again, I realize it might be a very stupid question.
I'm going to say something which touches Estonia, because we can think about Arvo Pärt. Once he found out who he was musically, despite he's creating all these different works, he's continuing his method. And so I think Cage, in a lot of ways, is childlike in his ability to sort of just play and explore. What happens if? You know, here's a man who, for many years of his adult life, had to go into the forest to find things to eat. He had no money. Yet he died a multimillionaire. That's got to change you somehow. The work is completed by the person who receives it. So while Cage makes the work, it's not done until somebody comes to it. And when you come to this work, you come with your own training, your own experiences, your own sort of aesthetic paradigms. And so it's not Cage who is Cage is asking you to kind of question those things in yourself. I was one of those people who believed he was a clown and a charlatan and a jokester, until one day I finally got what 433 was about, and my brain exploded. So when the paradigm shifts, for example, if you're not academically trained as a musician, say for example you're an artist, you're a poet, and you come to a Cage concert, you experience that music completely differently than somebody who's taken 4 years of harmony and counterpoint. Because that training gives you baggage that you come with, and you superimpose this baggage. Oh, you know, Professor so-and-so said no parallel fifths and direct octaves is bad, and yet they abound in Cage's music. And the idea is to sort of free yourself from that, which is so difficult. And in a sense, this is really sort of the root of what Cage's interest in Buddhism is, and that is to just let all things be without judgment, which is so difficult because we love to judge. Nobody has question?
okei
Okay, I'm done.
aitäh, suur tänu.